Relationships are complicated beasts. Not everyone is compatible with everyone, and sometimes a relationship is doomed to fail no matter how hard you work on it. This is especially true for people who probably shouldn't be in a relationship at all. People who lack the maturity to actually be the supportive and loving partner that they need to be. People who expect someone else to fill the void inside them and make them whole despite how unfair it is to ask anyone to do that. But because these same people are unable or unwilling to actually look at themselves in an introspective lens, they end up projecting their crap onto everyone around them, especially their partner, who has to not just carry the weight of it, but is intentionally or unintentionally made responsible for it. In other words, people who have dominant toxic traits will always hurt the ones closest to them, even if they don't mean to. However, that does not mean these toxic traits need to stay. They can be beaten, they can be overcome, and a relationship can be saved from its most toxic elements. But the process to do so is ugly. Like really fucking ugly. And to examine the ups and downs of that journey, let's talk about Scott Pilgrim. Scott Pilgrim was a 6-volume series that ran from 2004 to 2010, written and drawn by Canadian author Brian Lee O'Malley, and published by Oni Press. Although you probably know it from the movie adaptation, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, directed by the immaculate Edgar Wright, which came out just 1 month after the release of the last volume. While the film was received well by critics upon release, it didn't do great financially, but is now widely regarded as a cult classic and for good reason. And before I go too deep into this, let me just say that I also love the movie, but I'm going to be doing a lot of comparisons to the source material that may sound like I'm shitting on it. I'm not, mostly, but there are differences we need to talk about. Now, if you're watching a video about Scott Pilgrim, I'm going to assume it's because you're also a fan of the film, which means I'm only going to go over the basics of the general plot before we get into where the book branches off. But if for some reason you're not familiar with Scott Pilgrim, let's go over it real quick. Scott Pilgrim stars, who else? Scott Pilgrim, a 23-year-old bass player living in Toronto, Canada with his gay best friend Wallace, who, despite being a trope, has aged shockingly well all things considered. They live in a tiny studio apartment mostly owned by Wallace. The story starts with the declaration that he is dating 17-year-old high schooler Knives Chao, as an obvious to everyone rebound from his last relationship with mega rock star Envy Adams, before she was famous anyway. Both the book and the movie make it pretty clear how much of a creep and overall awful human being Scott is for dating an openly naive, peppy, vulnerable, and underage girl, but the book definitely doubles down on a lot harder. Anyway, shortly after Scott starts dating his fake high school girlfriend, he meets Ramona, a punk rock-esque woman who just moved into Toronto after breaking up with her own partner, Gideon Graves. Scott immediately becomes obsessed with her and decides he has to be with her, despite how chicken shit he is about breaking up with Knives before he starts to pursue her. Scott is, somehow, successful in wooing Ramona and destroys poor Knives' heart in the process. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying he shouldn't have broken up with her, I'm saying that he shouldn't have dated her in the first place. But he finds out there's a catch. In order to be Ramona, he must find and defeat the League of Ramona's Evil Exes, a collection of her evil ex-partners who have banded together under the leadership of Gideon Graves in order to control Ramona's love life. These exes include Matthew Patel, an Indian hipster with mystical powers, Lucas Lee, a pro skater turned action movie star, Todd Ingram, a bass player of Envy's band The Clash of Demon Head who has vegan psychic powers. None of this makes sense, just go with it. Roxy Richter, who's the only ex-girlfriend who possesses ninja skills, and Kyle and Ken Kachinagi, Japanese twins who are experts in robotics. All culminating in a foul showdown with Gideon Graves, who owns a series of popular clubs and theaters, including the Chaos Theater Toronto, where their final battle takes place. It's Scott's mission to defeat each of these exes and prove his love to Ramona, all the while working through his own issues to figure out if he even deserves her in the first place. Okay, basic premise established, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Now, to the movie's credit, it sticks with the books pretty much shot for shot up until around volume 3, at which point it starts to veer off. Granted, this was inevitable considering the fact that the film had to condense 6 volumes into a 2-hour movie, and the movie went into production shortly after the release of the first volume, so there was a good amount of improvising as they went along. But in doing so, they did make some changes that alter the overall nuance of the series quite a bit. The biggest of which being the timeline. The movie takes place over the course of several weeks or months, it's never explicitly established. The book, on the other hand, takes place over the course of a year, which means it has a lot more time to flesh out not just Scott and Ramona's relationship, but his relationship with his previous partners and his role in why they fell apart. Before we get into that, however, let's talk about the one incredibly important thing both the film and the book agree on. Scott Pilgrim is a massive toxic prick. He's selfish, manipulative, impulsive, and very rarely thinks about the consequences of his actions, among other pretty damning traits. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to call him a narcissist because he still does clearly care about his friends and partners. He's just kind of a moron about it, but that being said, if you were to call him a narcissist, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. And in that same vein, the book is much more critical of Scott as a character than the film is. Sure, the film doesn't really let him get away with much, and the other characters are frequently pointing out what a massive douchebag he is, but it's also kind of hand-waved away as that kind of endearing man-child character trait. You know, that increasingly annoying trait that's been pretty popular with other selfish man-children who may or may not play Chris Pratt. I'd low-hanging fruit. I know, I'll do better, I promise. The book, on the other hand, spends a good amount of time actively confronting Scott with how much damage his selfishness causes, not just to his current relationship with Ramona, but every woman he's ever been in a relationship with, period. It's made crystal clear pretty early on that Scott, despite whatever intentions he might have, is not afraid to use women to avoid dealing with his own feelings. And while this is evident in the movie as well, the book makes it much more explicit and much more openly uncomfortable. The most obvious victim of this is Knives Chao, who spends a good amount of time in both the movie and the book openly pining for Scott and wants to get back together with him. However, the resolution to her story in each is very different. The movie ends with Knives pushing Scott to be with Ramona, having accepted he had cheated on her, and ready to move on with her own life. It's played very sweetly and happily, and never fully acknowledges the fact that the relationship was never real to begin with. It was Scott using her innocence and naivete to mask his own insecurities. Sidebar, this is also one of the biggest reasons why the Scott Knives shippers and those who want the original ending to the movie are wrong. The other reason being, of course, that's actually just a literal fucking child. But the book, because of its longer timeline, actually has Knives turn 18 by the final volume, a time in which Ramona has actually left Scott after he defeated the Kazunagi twins. We'll get to that later. This means that Scott is once again painfully alone and looking for a way to hide from his feelings. So what's the first thing Scott does when he finds out Knives is 18? He immediately propositions her for casual sex. Like, loudly. Very, very loudly. But thankfully, she turns him down, because she's actually had some time to grow up a little bit and realize that Scott wasn't good for her. In fact, in retrospect, he was a shitty boyfriend to begin with, although he doesn't see it that way. We'll get to that later too. And when all is said and done, she's outgrown him, and she doesn't want him anymore. She's moved on. Even when they try to make out shortly after, it's a horrible experience for both of them. Because Scott isn't getting that naive hero worship anymore, and Knives is too mature to fall for his tricks. Therefore, there's nothing between them anymore. And she's hardly the only victim of Scott's selfishness. The other one in the series highlights the most is actually Kim. The film makes a brief reference to Scott and Kim's relationship, but the series goes to a much greater depth. In fact, Kim displays a significantly larger role in the overall story in general in the books. Kim and Scott were childhood sweethearts, and while Scott seems to have a very romanticized view of their relationship, where he had to fight the villainous Simon Lee to save her in high school and was cut short because he had moved to Toronto, Kim reveals a much more toxic pattern of arrogance and negligence, where she only found out he was moving through a mutual friend and he just beat up some poor Asian kid because they dated briefly and he hugged her once. Even his relationship with Envy Adams involves Scott openly ignoring or conveniently forgetting his own role in how things fell apart. And this is a pattern that repeats itself over and over again, with Scott consistently putting on rose-tinted glasses and sincerely believing that his previous relationships were these perfect affairs where he was the pinnacle of virtue and his exes worshipped him. He consistently creates these scenarios in his head where he is the hero of the story and a victim of their heartbreak, a notion he is frequently disillusioned of as the story progresses. And what starts that disillusionment is his relationship with Ramona, a woman with plenty of her own baggage that Scott has to literally and metaphorically tackle throughout the story. His relationship with Ramona is, arguably, his first real adult relationship, where he can't hide behind his immaturity and his impulsivity becomes significantly less charming. As the book starts to veer away from the central premise of fighting her evil exes, Scott has to start actively fighting the real issues that come up with having a real long-term relationship, like actually getting a job, working on each other's insecurities, moving in together, and dealing with temptation when it comes up. While all of these things happen over the course of the series, it's that last one that actually pushes Scott towards genuine personal growth. In fact, you can argue it's the first real step in Scott realizing he needs to make a change if he wants the relationship to work. And that comes in the form of a character that's not in the movie at all, Lisa. Lisa was one of Scott's oldest high school friends who he lost touch with after he moved to Toronto. They were never actually a thing, but it's made pretty obvious that it wouldn't take much to change that. Something Ramona picks up on pretty quick. This eventually culminates in a fight in which Scott needs to find a place to stay for the night after his attempts to shack up with Wallace results in seeing some things he didn't want to see. As a result, being the idiot that he is, he decides to call Lisa and stay with her at her sister's apartment. Although, to be fair, at least he's well aware of how terrible an idea this is. And it isn't long until Lisa reveals that she's been deliberately dressing sexy around him in an attempt to get his attention and then proposes they actually hook up. But to the surprise of even Scott, he turns her down, saying that he's too in love with Ramona. Now, to be clear, As far as decent human behavior and relationships go, this is bare minimum. But considering that Scott was more than okay with ditching knives to Ramona at the drop of a hat, you gotta get credit for growth when you see it. And the action does encourage Scott to start getting his shit together, acknowledging his mistakes to Ramona and establishing that he is willing to fight not just for evil exes, but to make the relationship work. But even when you start fighting back against your own toxic traits, that doesn't suddenly mean you're free from the consequences of them, as Scott soon learns. Scott declaring his love and that he's going to do better isn't enough to escape the inevitable, when Ramona finds out he was cheating on her with knives. See, in the movie, this topic is briefly addressed, with Scott acknowledging what he did as a sign of self-growth, and everyone moving on pretty much immediately after. The book goes into it a little deeper, starting with the fact that Knives is well aware that Scott cheated on her with Ramona, and is the one to tell Ramona about it, as opposed to both of them find out in the climactic battle. Ramona then sits on this information, lets it slowly build in her mind, and leads to resentment and frustration, rightfully so. And she doesn't confront him about this in the final battle of Gideon or in this big explosive way. She confronts him in the intimate space of their shared bed. He tries to justify his actions, poorly, and explains that he's trying to be better than he was. But obviously, this isn't enough. The damage is done. Ramona's view of him has shifted from that of a decent, kind guy to another evil ex waiting to happen. This is what culminates in Ramona leaving him, left with the weight and pain of his actions, past and present. And it's at this point that Scott has no choice but to own the consequences laid upon him, or else let his arrogance and victimhood reign supreme. And to his credit, he starts to do the work, starting with apologizing to Kim before she moves away. Granted, this process is far from immediate. He does try to proposition Knives not too long after, as we've already discussed. But then he starts becoming aware of how so many of his friends are moving on with their lives as he's stubbornly clinging on to his childlike ways, eventually leading him to visit Kim at her childhood home for a wilderness sabbatical. There, Kim calls him out for how he treated her during the relationship, and he experiences the greatest sense of cognitive dissonance, where his sense of self and his false perception of his life story violently clashes with harsh reality. In this case, this happens quite literally in the form of Negascott. In the movie, just a one-note joke. In the book, a bit more metaphysical. Here, Negascott isn't necessarily his opposite. He's every dark instinct and trait that Scott refuses to acknowledge, that he'd rather fight to the death than admit even exists. He is literally the violent effects of all of Scott's worst actions. And as Kim rightfully points out, the more he forgets his mistakes, the more he'll repeat them. The longer he ignores what he's done, the more they'll follow him. Scott eventually absorbs his darker half when he realizes that doing so is the only way he'll get Ramona back, even though he knows he doesn't deserve her. Which leads us to the final confrontation against Gideon, and also the last phase of Scott's growth from his worst self. And this is where I need to compare the book and movie again real quick, because this is also one of the major branching off points between the two. In the movie, there are parallels between Gideon and Scott you can draw upon, but it's not made entirely clear what role he's supposed to play in the overall narrative, correct me if I'm wrong. Again, this isn't the movie's fault because it's likely that Brian O'Malley didn't know either until he was doing some rewrites deep into the film's production, but that's speculation. Anyway, the point is that the book makes it very clear that Gideon is essentially supposed to represent the worst case scenario Scott, who Scott could have become if he let all his worst tendencies take hold. Gideon is greedy, possessive, obsessive, narcissistic, and arrogant to his core. Gideon is a man who treats women like objects and goes to great efforts to objectify them to the point where he literally has all his exes cryogenically frozen and dressed up like punk rock Barbies so no one else can have them. In fact, by his own admission, Gideon started the League of Evil Exes through a drunk rant on Reddit. Also, another sidebar, because I know someone's going to bring this up otherwise, there is a brief plot point about Gideon messing with some of Scott's memories, which is why some are romanticized, but it's very briefly glossed over, never brought up again, and kind of contradicts everything else that happened in the book, so I'm just more or less ignoring that piece. Gideon is a deeply insecure man parading his entitlement as power, his need for control as a will to succeed. A man who treats contradiction to his memory with violence and malice. Who at one point compensates for his deeply fragile masculinity by literally making himself bigger and buffer to the extent that even Scott can see how pathetic this man really is. The kind of monster that will control women because they're more valuable to him as trophies than as living, breathing people. A symbol to his own perceived power and status, whose only purpose is to smile and submit. A man Ramona finally breaks free from, and Scott realizes he's dangerously susceptible to becoming if he's not careful. And that leads to the last film in the book comparison I want to talk about, because it's something that never really made much sense to me from the movie. In the movie, Scott defeats Gideon by earning the power of self-respect, in this universe manifesting as a big fuck-off sword. But that was never Scott's problem in the book or the movie. Yeah, he's insecure as all hell, but the source of his problem was never a lack of self-respect. In fact, he spends a majority of the movie doing everything pretty much only for himself, so why would fighting Gideon for himself suddenly be his saving grace? But in the book, it's not the power of self-respect, but the power of understanding. He sees Gideon acting monstrous, and it finally clicks how he's been monstrous too. He understands how someone like Gideon could become the way he is, because he became dangerously close to becoming that way himself. He learns compassion, he learns empathy, he learns how to think outside himself and to the people around him. That's how he and Ramona are able to defeat Gideon and try their love again. Now with the full understanding of who they are and how they need to grow, they consciously make the choice to leave their worst traits behind and start to build new and better ones. And I think that's the beauty of Scott's little manic journey. It demonstrates that not only is it possible to grow past your most toxic traits, but that it's worth the struggle to do so. Because all of us have some toxicity in some form or another. Maybe we're more aggressive than we like to be, or too stubborn, or too arrogant, what have you. All of us are capable of some pretty heinous shit, and we've all done something to that extent that we likely deeply regret. But I think we can also agree that some people definitely have more toxic traits than others. And unfortunately, they're often the same people most unwilling to do anything about it. And equally as unfortunate, the people most hurt by these same traits tend to be the ones in their most intimate relationships, whether that's platonic or otherwise. It's all too common a story to hear about someone who was stuck in an abusive relationship for far too long, where they became stuck with someone who actively seeks to put them down emotionally, physically, mentally, or all three. Where they're too hesitant to leave that relationship, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they think that their behavior is only temporary, or sometimes because they think they can save the other from their worst selves. Granted, this is a very simplistic view of it. The reasons for staying can be much more complicated, but that's a topic for another day. Scott Pilgrim does a fantastic job at showing that it is possible for someone to change out of that self and learn what it means to be a better partner. And the book also makes it clear that it isn't because somebody saved him from himself. It's because Scott was forced to face that self, forced to deal with the consequences of his actions. And when he faced that side of him, he was given an extremely important choice. Own the consequences and confront the reality it caused, no matter how painful, or wallow in his victimhood and blame everyone else. Up until he faces Scott, he chooses the latter, lamenting how unfair the world is to him and expressing entitlement to everyone's time and assistance. It isn't until everyone stops letting him get away with his bullshit that he realizes the damage that he's wrought, and it's heartbreaking for him. But it also provides him with the clarity he needs to be the partner Ramona can grow with, as opposed to the partner she needs to placate. Because no one can force someone else to address their own toxic traits. No one. If you think you can, you will fail. Because making the choice to do that is long and agonizing, and also a deeply personal choice. You need to want to unlearn that toxic behavior, to want to see who you are on the other side of it, but it is not a decision commonly made. A lot of people like Scott would much rather stay the way they are, reveling in their worst impulses and expecting the world to give them what they want. And it's the people who are in their orbit that suffer the most for it. Now with all that said, I would like to take this opportunity to address the two key demographics for this video directly. For those who are currently in a relationship with someone who exhibits toxic traits, you know who you are. You may not like it, but here is an extremely important fact that I want you to remember. You cannot force someone to change who has no interest in changing. Meaning that if you are with someone because you think you can change them and their toxic traits, and you're only with them because you're waiting for that change to happen or to match some potential you've decided they have in your head, your relationship is already over and you haven't acknowledged it yet. Some of the more clever ones might play the part for a bit to convince you that they are changing, but that will go away once you become comfortable and complacent again. Trust me, get out now while you can, if you can. Because you just can't force someone to go on that journey. You can't force them to make that choice. Even if you do somehow force them to do it, and they do, they're just going to blame you when things get hard and resent you for it. Let's also be perfectly clear on another important factor. It is not your job, your responsibility, nor obligation to stick with someone who is toxic, whether or not they are aware of or are working to fix it. There is absolutely no reason you need to put yourself through that, even if they are working to change that about themselves. If it is actively causing you harm to be in any kind of relationship with this person, romantic or otherwise, it is absolutely all right and encouraged to put this person behind you. Maybe one day if they succeed in overcoming the worst traits, you can reconnect and start again. But there is no reason you need to put yourself in harm's way while they figure their shit out, if they ever do at all. because you are putting a massive target on your head to receive the worst of the toxicity by choosing to stay with them when it's become more than clear that all it's doing is slowly killing you. Now, for those who currently have the aforementioned toxic traits, unfortunately you probably don't know who you are, but if anything I've said so far has made you uncomfortable, you might want to start asking yourself why. Here's an important note for all of you. Your toxicity will eventually push everyone away from you no matter how tightly you try to hold on to them. But it is not too late for you to change and be a better person. The journey to do that will be difficult and you will involve confronting a lot of hard truths about yourself that you won't like to hear, but you'll need to. And during that process, more than likely, you'll have a light bulb moment when it's going to click for you how toxic you really are. It could be by seeing someone you hate exhibit the same behaviors. It could be by having people tell you how events in your relationships or life really happened. It could be through therapy. In fact, I would heavily encourage therapy. Whatever it might be, something is going to wake you up to your bullshit, and it's going to be ugly. But when it does happen, you'll know you're doing something right. Because you cannot rebuild yourself into something better without first tearing your old self down. And the process of doing so is ugly, uncomfortable, and painful. It takes more courage and strength than you've probably ever exhibited in your life, but I promise you, the relationships, friendship or otherwise, that'll develop when you reach the other side will trump anything you could ever gain from your worst self. And you'll eventually look back on that old version of you and wonder how the hell you let that go on for so damn long. But if you go the other way, you double down. You insist it's everyone else who's crazy, or a bitch, or a slut, or an asshole, that nothing is ever your fault, everyone else just needs to get on board with just how awesome you are, then I honestly feel sorry for you. Because it's such a hollow, nothing way to live. It's a life ruled by internalized insecurity and self-hatred, overcompensating for a need for the kind of love you've never had. Maybe that need was born from childhood trauma or any other number of causes that could have brought it up. But if you insist on clinging to it as an adult because the alternative is too hard or scary to pursue, or you think you just shouldn't have to do it, my friend, it's nobody else's fault at that point. You're just a fucking asshole. And while I know that simple statement will likely do very little to change your mind, I genuinely hope you find your way back from that toxicity. That you're willing to fight and claw your way out of the mindset that will scream at you to take it back like an evil ex. Because the freedom that comes from escaping it, love you can find in that journey, not just from others, but from yourself, will give you the first real chance of happiness you've probably ever had in your life. And doesn't that sound like it's worth pursuing? Doesn't that sound so much better than dwelling in the worst parts of yourself? I hope so. And if you don't feel that way now, I hope you do in the future. Because something that I think applies to all of us. The strength you feel from conquering your worst self will make you feel like you can take on the whole world.